Welcome to LinkedUp, Breaking Boundaries in Education, a podcast that focuses on what is happening in education today, connecting everyone to the movers and shakers that are breaking boundaries in the education arena.
Hello, this is Jamie and Jerry from LinkedUp, Breaking Boundaries in Education podcast. Now, we are trying to branch out into different platforms and expand our conversation that is one-sided in podcast form into Clubhouse so we can have dialogue with people. And we have just really been fortunate to meet some really great people from around the world. So we get amazing global perspectives that way. And Jerry met today's guest in that way.
So we have had a lot of conversations with Lottie, and she actually was on a podcast with us. And we continue to communicate behind the scenes with her. And sometimes she sees things that we're doing or suggests great people to be on our podcast. And Alan is the result of a great conversation with Lottie. Alan does some really interesting work and a very deep dive into gender, ethnicity, and global leadership. Very fascinating, the work that he's doing and some of the findings that he's getting into. So, Alan, welcome to the LinkedUp podcast. We are so happy to have you here today. We know you have to get up earlier being on the West Coast. But good morning and welcome. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, how long you've been in education, and what brought you to this particular topic?
Sure. So I have been in education for about 25 years, and I've been overseas for about 20 years. And so what prompted me to get into this work was because I worked in California for many years, worked in Washington, D.C. as well. And I see a lot of people of color, LGBT teachers in different areas. And when I went overseas, that changed dramatically. And so very white international school teachers. And I was one of the very few people in there. And when I moved into leadership, it became even a stark difference between white educators and also white leaders and people of color as well. And so very few of us out there. And so I dedicated my doctorate work into this area. So I started studying gender and ethnicity in international school leaders. And that's what prompted everything. And what got me going was when I went to conferences and I would look for people like me, and there weren't that many of us. And so when I started dedicating the work to it, I found that there are not that many of us in general. And so the data shows that there is a huge gap in the data with gender and also with ethnicity, which I can share a little bit later as well. But this is basically how I got into the work.
That's interesting to me, too, because we've done podcasts before on students and their perspective when they don't have teachers who look like them, when they live in a world that doesn't reflect who they are. And I can't remember, it was Ken Shelton who told us about this, but I can't remember the woman who phrased this, but windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors, right? And so, I think it's interesting. We always think of the importance of that for children, but even as adults, I think you have feelings about that, right? There's something lacking in your work and the way you go about your day and your world.
Yeah. So the mirror concept and sliding doors is really important for kids. And so it's really important that not just in the US, but also internationally. So if you were to pick a school in Asia, which is where I'll be working, and I worked in India and in Shanghai, the majority of the teachers were white. You wouldn't even have Indian teachers. You have some Indian teachers, some Chinese teachers, but the majority of the teachers are there, really very white. And so there's a lot of pushback now, even from kids, especially high school kids, saying, we need more perspectives. And then you look in the leadership roles, there are a lot of men in leadership, and I'm speaking as a man. And so I think I would just connect out back to the data. So ISS did International School Services did a survey recently, and this is this year, and I did my data 3 years ago. So if you look at the data of leaders in general, from principals at that level, and that is, let's say 50% of the leaders are female and 50 are men, about the same, maybe slightly more women. But when you move up into the superintendent level, the director level, for my data, it dropped down to 40% women, and ISS even dropped even worse, 25% women. And so why is that the case when you have so many principals, director of teachers and learning, and it dropped dramatically? We're talking about 50% in the most recent data to 25% of women are in that top position. Why? So we need to ask those questions. And then this is where we come in. There's a lot of implicit bias, recruitment bias training later on as well, which I can touch on also.
Right. Have you found any findings as to why there are so many more men in the field than women?
Well, there's this. I mean, we have been trained in our world that men and leadership is the equivalent. You see men and you see leaders.
Right.
Harvard does the implicit bias association test. And so if you actually find the implicit association test from Harvard, let's say, for example, you were to choose the word science, 75% is associated to men, not women.
Right.
Yeah. And they have a collection of data from thousands of people doing those tests. And so, yeah, we've been trained to say that leaders are men. We've had that implicit bias ingrained in us. And so that's why it's a tough job for women to get that top position in schools. It's the same data in US schools as well. Only 25% of women are superintendents in schools in the US.
It's funny, even when you look at just marketing graphics, you always see handshakes of men's hands, or just even in those things, I noticed that. Do you think, and maybe this is an implicit bias on my part, but I'm just thinking, women have babies. Women often will stay home with their children. So they stop their career at being teachers often. Sometimes they'll move forward to being a principal. Maybe superintendent is goes later into the evenings. Does that sometimes play a role? That role of a woman being the mother and the caretaker?
Of course, there's a lot of bias against women with children already that exists in the world. But I think if you actually look at the layer of principals, after being a principal, you become, a head of school or a superintendent, work for a central office. But if you look at that data set alone, most of those women are usually older, in their 40s, sometimes even 50s. So when they stop having children already. And so if you look at that data alone, and then to the next level, there isn't an equivalent of 50% up at the superintendent level or the director, because it's still a low number. And the question is really, in our society, in our world, there is a huge bias against women in leadership. And so that's what you have to really deconstruct. And this is where the training goes into those who are selecting the committees that are selecting those superintendents, and also those directors in schools. They need to go through training themselves, because they have had their own bias. They don't even know. That's why it's called implicit bias, unconscious bias. So they don't know that when they're looking at a profile of a man, they are veering themselves toward that man rather than the woman, and looking at the experience of the woman outshining. And, there also are research out there that women usually undersell themselves and men oversell themselves. And so there is that bias as well. And women say, I'm not qualified for the job, because they say they see one thing and they're like, well, I'm not that person. And a man would look at that job and say, I got this. I don't know it, but I'm going to pretend I do, and I'll get that job. And so there's a lot of that in our society as well. And so it's something that we have to undo. And it's not easy, to unlearn something. It's much harder than to learn something.
That's true. You brought up a memory for me. I had applied for a superintendent position, and the team that was running the search called me back and said, "Oh my goodness, we heard a comment we had not heard before." One of the board members came to the search team and said, "I can't believe how many girls applied for this." And the search team said they're not girls.
Yeah, they're not girls.
They are very educated women that know what they're doing.
Yeah.
And, he said, "I just want you to know this could be what you're stepping into."
Because they would never have said there's so many boys applying for this.
That's right. Yes. So you just brought up that memory for me.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And it's unfortunate. That's what we mean, like by the world view women very differently. And so so just imagine a woman of color. So now you have two things going against you. And so that's why it's really challenging for those who are going into the positions and applying for that. And even when you look at the people of color in the US, it goes down to, I think, 3 to 5% of people of color are in superintendent roles. And so if you look at our population, it's a lot higher than that. And so there should be an equivalence of, when you look at the data, if it's 15% of people of color, it should be 15% of people of color in the superintendent role.
Absolutely. And I think women do have the imposter syndrome and feel like they're not adequate in a place. I know probably Jamie and I have both gone through that in our life, feeling I'm just not there. But then sometimes being in meetings with all men, I think I might be there.
Yeah.
After I hear the conversation. Yes, I think we're underestimated many times.
Certainly.
Yes.
Definitely.
Yes.
And we underestimate ourselves, agreed. So I'm just trying to think of ways to combat this. So one thing that I was wondering is, could there naturally be a shift, gradual probably, because you made me think of this, Jerry, when you said that you were referenced as a girl. I feel like that's like I don't know, older gentlemen perhaps may have that mindset, right? Because they grew up with that, right? So are we eventually going to kind of remove ourselves from that mindset because it's going to be washed out at some point as we grow? I don't know, could that hopefully be the case? But then also I wonder if there's more awareness now too, because of certain research that you're doing is an example.
Yeah, I think it would be, it's a slow process and it's a lot of work as well. And so I think the training I do implicit bias training, and I also do recruitment bias training for international schools. So schools would call me up, ask me to do a training for the entire team. And so what they go through is actually, they have to understand their own implicit bias. So when you look at a name, I'll give you an example. Let's say you're looking at a name of let's say a gentleman who's 59 years old, and he's applying for a tech coach position. There's a huge bias there already. Why? Because he's 59 years old, and let's say a woman, 59 years old and a tech coach. We see tech and young people. We don't see tech as older people. So that's like we have that bias like in there in our head without even knowing it. And so how do you undo that when you're already saying, I'm going to push that application aside without even properly looking at it because of ageism?
Right.
And so
Very much so.
Yeah, so very much so. So it's really, you have to raise making the unconscious conscious. So in order to do that, you have to practice, So for example, Alan Phan is my professional name. My real name is Long, spelled, it's awful in English. It's great in Vietnamese. But when I started out my career, I applied as Long Phan. It was terrible. I did not get very many positions because they see Long Phan. How does this person speak English? I have a degree from a university. Now I have I have a doctorate from a university in England. But if I use Phan to apply for a position internationally, I wouldn't get jobs.
So, you know what? It's so funny you said that, because I just said, perhaps we will actually grow out of this over time through awareness. But then as you said that, it just made me realize, no, we haven't, because my grandfather came here from Italy and his name is Vito, but he had to change his name to John because of the same thing. So this was in the early 1900s. So we really haven't evolved much at all.
We haven't evolved much because that there's still, again, there is that association with names, nationalities, with the English language. There's so many bias out there, and that's what we have to work on. In order for us to make that shift, you have to raise all the unconscious conscious so that you can work against those bias. And so when I run through the workshop there, I go through Milton Bennett's continuum of bias and anti-bias work. And really, it's really about accepting the differences around the world, that you and I have different perspectives. We're all Americans, right? And so you say, well, you're American, you should know that. I'm like, well, it's a white American, Mexican American, Asian American. We all have different perspectives. So you lump everybody into that generalization. Now you have negated everyone else's experience. So you would say, oh, Jerry, you're a white woman, you should know about this, or you're a white person, you should know this. But you experience as a white woman is very different from a white man.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And you say, we talked about you from the Midwest, from the area. Yeah. Saying how that, like, if you see that, she's from the Midwest, I'm not sure, like she could be
exactly
a supporter of other people. And we're like, well, no, you just kind of associate one thing to another that has no association. And that's an implicit bias.
Well, the other thing that I hear from a lot of friends is, I'm colorblind. I don't see color. And that is not helpful.
No, not at all. So basically,
why is it not helpful?
Because if you are a Black woman going through life, if you don't see her Blackness going through life, you've negated all of her experiences as a Black person. So what she goes through in life is so different from what I go through and what you go through. And so now you don't see color, you have negated all of her experiences in life for years. And so accept that her experience is very different. And if you are a good friend, you would ask, hey, tell me what happened to that with that situation, and empathize. And that's part of the continuum, is to learn how to empathize. There's a great video about a pianist, I can't think of his name right now, where he was talking to his grandfather, was opening a business and applying for a loan back in the 50s. And he went to one bank after another, could not get a loan. Of course, there's a Black man in the 50s applying for a loan. So what did he do? He only sent it in to the bank.
Oh.
First bank he got the loan immediately. Because, well, guess what? They didn't see the Black man applying for the loan. They saw the name and the business looked good, so they got the loan immediately. And so that's what I mean. Yeah, it's fascinating that way, right? So don't deny people of their experiences. Even same thing with gender.
So we have to keep that in mind. We have to accept people and use empathy to have a lens into perhaps what their lives are, acknowledge that, but at the same time, remove any bias that may exist, perhaps because of that. So there's a balance that really needs to be in place. I could see why coaching like that you do is really important.
Yeah, it's not easy, to be very honest with you. So I have a doctorate in this area. I still have to fight myself when I do something. So I have to say, okay, Alan, you're looking at this. You need to look at this through a lens very, very carefully, because you're looking at, like, let's say I see a woman from China applying for an English position. I have to fight that bias that I have that I see. For myself. And this is somebody who's, I feel like, very well trained, well educated about this. And I have to say, okay, let's look at her experiences. Let's go through her references and see if she is actually the best candidate for the job. And so I put everything aside and then look at her as a candidate, not because she's Chinese and not because she's a woman either,
Remove the stereotype, view the person.
Correct.
Yeah. No, and I guess it's hard. It can be hard because we've kind of and when I say stereotype, but at the same time, as you said, we still need to celebrate and embrace their background. Yeah. So I can see how this coaching is necessary. And it's funny because I work with international schools every day, and I do see exactly what you are talking about. I see mainly male in technology. So mainly male leaders, and a lot of them are American. So not all, but and it depends on the part of the world too.
Yeah. And so this is the reason why I actually started a recruitment website for international school teachers. So for people of color and LGBT candidates. So I call this my pandemic project. People do different things.
Yes.
So I did this. So I started a website, and actually it was developed by young women who created the website for me. And so I said, I need to find women who develop these websites, and there are Asian women developers. I said, fantastic, you hired. And it's a recruitment website where you can actually go onto the platform as a school. You look for people of color and also LGBT candidates, and LGBT candidates and people of color educators can sign on, and then we connect the school and the candidates together. So they post jobs and they apply for it. I just launched it 2 months ago. We have about 250 candidates and about 65 schools now.
Wow.
It's a really good start. And so it's called the diversityfair.org if you want to look it up. And so it's going to be something that we're hoping that it continues to grow. And it is something that we want to continue to develop over time. And hopefully this becomes a good platform for international educators.
Right. Are you finding that there's interest in this, that international schools are really searching and seeking diversity?
Very much so. I think because the whole George Floyd that brought DEI work into the international school realm. And actually, a lot of it came from students saying, what are we doing about it? Mm-hmm. How can we make a difference? And really, the students are the one pushing the envelope to get the educators to do the work. And so this is why the DEI work has been really propelled quite a bit in international schools. That's why, people are seeking me out to do implicit bias and the recruitment bias training for their schools to diversify their faculty. It's not good enough to say, oh, we're just going to find the people coming to us. They're pushing us to say, hey, you need to go look for some other candidates, especially in the pipeline of leaders. And then the conversation I had this morning at 5 a.m. was with AAIE, basically the Association of International School Development, and talking to them saying, hey, if you have a finalist pool of principals, make sure you have one woman in there, make sure you have a person of color, and a third person, whoever you want. But if you do that as a minimum, then that means you're forced to go out to look for a woman. You're forced to go out to look for a person of color as part of your pool. Because if you just wait for people to come to you, it's easy. Then you're just like, hey, if a pool of men, we're just going to have that. And the lack of perspective from the gender and also the ethnicity, it's we owe it to our kids to have more perspectives in the school than just from men or from just white men.
That's really important, not just to kind of put it out there, wait for people to apply, because I think it goes back to our other conversation. Some people may think I'm not qualified, or I don't think I would get that, right? So then we're in this vicious cycle that way. So instead, be proactive. If you really care about making your staff diverse, especially when you have a diverse student population, especially when the students, as you said, are asking for this, then you actually have to be proactive and go out and do that. But then layering that is learning how to properly interview people, as you said, and that coaching is what I guess is the need, how that is going to combat that, right? To make sure that you are properly, you have a wide lens into learning about this person.
Yeah. And the one thing that I get pushed back on is, I'm not going to hire the person because the person is a color or the person is a woman. I'm like, absolutely not. You don't compromise your own principles for a good candidate. And that's honestly, it's a cop out when people say that. Like, I'm not going to compromise my school, my integrity to hire a person of color. I want to hire the best person of color. Yeah, best person. And if you actually go out to seek for them, you will find them. But if you don't do it, you're not going to find them. If you're looking in the same place, you're going to find the same people. So do it differently.
I have a kind of personal question to ask. Like, if I'm wanting to really reflect on my implicit bias, do you have a first step that I can take to or a question I can ask myself, or how can I really reflect on that so that as I move forward, my decisions are thinking about diversity?
Yeah. So for implicit bias, there are lots of things you can think about just about yourself. If you think about, just look at names alone.
Mm-hmm.
There's usually a bias already with names.
Right.
If you see a Mario Gonzalez, you have an association with that. And so if you actually look at gender, there's a bias. Age, there's a bias. So if you are going to contact somebody or you're going to have trying to reach out to somebody, just think about yourself. Say, hey, this person, this name says this person's education is this is that. Think about what bias you might have already. If you're just even doing that, that's going to help quite a bit if you're raising your own awareness. And so if you have when you meet somebody, and the stature might be as a smaller person. There's a lot of bias with height. There's
Yes.
Like a short woman. There is
Hi, that's me.
There's an association of like, oh, she can't be a leader.
Right.
Yeah.
And I read somewhere that our presidents most of them have been over 6 foot tall. They're tall men.
Yeah.
Yes.
So there's a lot of association with that. Yeah. So actually, it's honestly when you see someone, when you think something, just check it. Just say, hey, I thought this about this person. Why?
Right.
Why did you do that? If you actually even just ask your question, just why, then you raise your own awareness into that.
All right, that's easy.
Yeah, that is easy.
I like that.
Yes, because it all starts with ourselves. I mean, we all have to do this work independently as well as through our district or our leadership. So I love that. What lessons have you learned through your research that could really impact all educators?
Oof, there's so much. That's another podcast. Jackie.
That's a whole nother podcast. Well, yes.
And so for me is then the biggest lesson I feel like comes down to some of the findings that I had in the global leadership. So going back to the data earlier is actually when you ask people to fill out surveys, I actually questioned my own data when I did the doctorate. So the data that I had was, I had almost 300 people answer the survey. And I want to say 77 were heads of schools, and 40% or so were women and 60% were men, right? But we're talking about the leadership is about 50-50. I question my own data saying it's because more women answer my data than men.
Yes.
It does not benefit men to answer this survey.
Oh, not worth their time.
Not worth their time. So I actually questioned my own data. And so when ISS did the data and it dropped down to 25%, okay, that's more accurate.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
So why would a man say, hey, this is good for me. Why would I do it? But you have more enlightened men who are willing to say, hey, I need to change this world in order to make sure that I have more women in leadership so that you have better perspective later on as well into that.
Yes.
My big learning is like not all men are there. It's not all people are there.
You're right. But we're making strides, I hope.
I'm hoping to. So
yes.
One podcast cast at a time.
One podcast at a time. Yes.
We're going to line you up for a couple more then too.
Right. We've already discussed implicit bias training and having a full podcast on that, which I think would be incredible. But until we do that, we'll start asking ourselves those questions to keep us in line. Yes. So, Alan, we always like to, we don't always get to it, but sometimes we do. We end with a final question where we ask our guests, in all of your work, what has become clear?
That this type of DEI work for schools, it's not a one session, it's not a one-time thing. So it's an ongoing work, and it's hard work. And it's not easy work because, when we're recruiting for women, we're recruiting for people of color. And you're just like, it's exhausting. And it's also, just imagine, it's also exhausting for the candidates.
Yes, it is.
It's exhausting when you are getting rejection one after another. And so it's exhausting. So for a woman of color, so I'm going to throw in there a lesbian, a woman of color. You have 3 strikes against you. Okay. Let's say you also have a wife and kids, and now you have a family going with it. And so those are the things that is exhausting for that one person. So if you are going to make sure that you are giving that person any justice, be sure that you are, make sure you honor everything that she goes through, that she's a woman, she's a person of color, and she's a lesbian. So that alone, if you actually understand that perspective and ask her, how's the recruiting going for you? That question alone will just honor her as a person. And so that I think it's going to be really important as we continue to do this work. And so it's not easy. I'm a person of color. I'm also completely open out, and I'm also married to a man. So when I go recruiting internationally, trust me, I've had many doors shut in my face along the way as well, just due to the fact that I'm Asian or due to the fact that I'm married to a man.
Right. Yeah. But you said it before, and I think this is the basis, and Jerry and I have heard this in different conversations on different topics in our varied podcasts. It's all based on empathy. I think if we start there, I think we can learn and grow and evolve, but we have to be open. And our hearts have to be open. We have to have that empathy. And for me, I feel like it's easy if you can step back and just view everything through that lens. And because maybe because I'm a former teacher, and that was no matter what I taught, that is what I taught every day, is teaching students how to be empathetic. But we lose that sometimes as adults. And I think if we just step back and have our lives, everyone else's lives, even viewed through that lens of empathy, I think it's going to make a big difference, but we have to be mindful of that.
And going back to the question that I posed before about asking the why, is actually, now the question is like, hey, if you asked yourself for perspective and empathy, what would a woman think? What would a person of color think? What would a man of color think? It's actually, well, what would a child think? You ask it through a different lens, and you create more empathy for yourself as well. So ask that question.
Right. This has been very enlightening. Thank you so much for the reflection and the ideas as to how to reflect. And I love, too, that you have this website to connect people around the world. In fact, I have a couple of friends that I am going to send them the website because they're looking for this kind of opportunity. And they are in the LGBTQ community. So very happy to send that to them. So thank you so much for spending time with us. And we will be having you back again for future conversations. And
on Clubhouse as well.
Yeah.
Yes, you're a pro at Clubhouse.
Yeah, I know how to do Clubhouse now. So I did a few sessions for them. So
Yes, absolutely. And I understand that the next time we talk, you may be living somewhere else in the
I
world.
might be in Vietnam the next time we talk, so it's okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, we can still communicate. So
we'll figure out a time.
Our
You
evenings,
bet.
Yes.
you bet. Well, thank you, Alan, so much for
Thank you,
being
Jackie.
on the show. And we'll make sure that we get the website so that we can put that in the show notes for everyone.
Great,
And then we will be on Clubhouse continuing this conversation.
All right. Thank you.